Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. This program emanates from Kazoo, K-A-Z-U, FM in Pacific Grove, California. It's broadcast number 681, December the 24th, 1984. Just one more program on New Year's Eve next week, and then we tuck this year away. For better or for worse, we have survived the year of 1984. But as Ronald Reagan said at the time that he won the election, you ain't seen nothing yet. And with that grin on his face, we don't know what he means by that. So some of us will have to wait and see. Last week, I finished the broadcast number 680 with sections from a book called The Year of Armageddon. These sections were mailed to me by some friends in the East. The authors are Gordon Thomas, Max Morgan. It's from Granada Press, London, 1984. And I'm sure that Tom Davis out here in Capitola, Anaptos, will be carrying this book, and you can order from him. But the importance of this particular chapter has to do, that I've been referring to, has to do with Wild Bill Donovan, William Donovan, his close relationship to the Vatican, and how he was knighted with the highest order of the Vatican. He was the chief of the OSS and then helped form the Central Intelligence Agency. And from the OSS days, working closely with the Vatican and simultaneously with Nazis such as Heinrich Himmler and SS Karl Wolff and a whole bag of Nazis, Reinhard Gehlen, and the aerospace Nazis. With that team of the Vatican and the Nazis and the American intelligence working together, when the war was over, the bonds got even closer because they had now to coexist with Russia, which the Vatican and the United States Pentagon never wanted anyway. And when the CIA was formed, we have our officials in Rome. It became the official espionage department of the United States government, but it also is a military branch, just as the Knights of Malta are a military branch. The sovereign military means military. If you look in the dictionary, sovereign is the supreme power and authority, and military relates to soldiers, arms, or war. Well, the Vatican doesn't have men in uniform that go out and fight, or tanks or airplanes, but it has the power over the members of the church to tell them, put on a uniform, to tell them, don't resist these people, to tell them to confess to political stories even, or political actions that they're doing. And they are very much a part, the Vatican and the intelligence community, of running the world, and the intelligence community can tell the Pentagon and tell Congress what to vote because we are in danger here or there. They are the intellectual military, but they are the military because you can't get the uniforms on and the war going without the idea first of who are your friends or who are your enemies. So this book says that the Knights of Malta serves an ideal cover for William Casey, because he can operate under the organization of the Knights of Malta, and it becomes military from the Vatican, and Casey is the chief director of the CIA at home. The book says that both the CIA and the Vatican know that it is essential for the Pope never to be seen openly or aligning himself with the political aims of the CIA. And I talked about that last week. You can't be seen walking in and out of the door every day, the CIA briefing him. Once a week is enough. And it says, working through an order, such as the Knights of Malta, the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the country's leading Catholics, and the CIA have a wider distance away from each other on an official level, but they can meet what you would describe as casually and still get together, and they appear to keep the distance away from each other, so that the Pope and the CIA station chief in Rome appear to have this distance so that they're not constantly having eye contact, but their messages in between, those men that have been made Knights of Malta, for the military part of protecting the Roman Church. The book says the CIA in Rome can brief the Pope once a week, and we talked about that. They can give him a weekly briefing, but the CIA would appear unacceptable if the station chief was in and out of the Pope's office every day. And I shared that with you last week, and we'll go on from there. It says, nowadays, William Casey doesn't have to fly to Rome. He doesn't even telephone the Vatican. He has powerful emissaries in the order, the Knights of Malta, the Sovereign Military Order, who convey to John Paul in an informal way what the CIA wants the Vatican to do. William Casey, the CIA director, has a wide choice of messengers, thousands of more to send to Rome. Some of these knights are secret. We don't know who they are. I'd like to know who they are. Some are well known, like Lee Iacocca, Spyros, Robert Abplanalp, that was the godfather of Richard Nixon's children. Nixon fly down to his place for briefings. Baron Hilton, and they mention 3 others in this book, maybe more later in the book, but in this chapter: William Simon, Robert Wagner, and Claire Luce. Now those 3 are important in addition to the ones I mentioned. But how does the Vatican and the policy of the military order of the Vatican affect domestic policy? William Simon is on the board of Helionetics, making the laser beams and Star Wars that the Russians do not want to get into with us, the weapons up in space. And he works with Edward Teller of the hydrogen bomb and Admiral Hayward. I mention these names many times, but every time he comes up with a new appointment or something that's pertinent, I want to repeat it till you really understand how far-reaching they are. William Simon was the former chairman of the Olympics, and I wonder what would have happened if the Soviet Union had appeared. And he recently, it seems, or was just exposed recently, as being on the team of Kissinger and Associates, working with Henry Kissinger and Lawrence Eagleburger in the Defense Department on that mysterious advisory group under the name of Henry Kissinger and Associates. Another member that they cite here is Robert Wagner, the former mayor of New York. He's the presidential envoy to the Holy See. Well, it was his law office of Mr. Wagner and Weiss and Simon Rifkin that set up the corporation papers for Otto von Bolschwing, the head of Reinhard Gehlen's domestic operations when Gehlen went back to Germany to be working with the BND, Hitler's chief of intelligence in the East. Gehlen was knighted by the Vatican, and Robert Wagner, a knight, can travel and in the offices with Mr. Rifkin. Claire Luce, I have mentioned many times before, and again, it's in this book, that's why I'm bringing it up again, is a Knight of Malta. Well, Henry Luce is long gone. He passed away a few years ago, but Lifetime and Fortune, Sports Illustrated, very political, and probably the 2 most political covers that I remember on the cover of Life magazine when Henry Luce was alive. One was the picture of Lee Harvey Oswald, the famous picture holding the rifle, and the shadows under his nose aren't the same as the shadows where the rifle falls, and Oswald saw it when he was alive and said that the picture was cut around and that it wasn't his body, it was his head and not his body. And the picture of Charles Manson at the time of the Manson killings to make appear that hippies and the deranged musician, the music occult group, killed Sharon Tate and Mr. Polanski and everyone in that house. Those 2 covers are very political statements because they are facts of disinformation. In other words, they're not facts at all. They're trying to project a thought in your mind that will be locked in there, but which in fact isn't the way it was told, and it was done for a purpose of propaganda. Now, left out of the list, and I won't run down their politics because you know how important they are, and think of them as passing messengers in and out of the Vatican, as J. Peter Grace, William Buckley, James Buckley, Alexander Haig, Patrick Frawley, Jeremiah Denton, and we could go on for many, many more. This book says all these persons have a common bond. They have the ability to call the Vatican switchboard and ask to be connected to extension 3101 to the Pope's desk at any time they want. They are knighted. And of course, James Jesus Angleton is a Knight of Malta. And you can't pass off the envoy to the Vatican, Mr. Wilson, William Wilson. Now, Wilson was formerly in charge of Ronald Reagan's personal finances. He's one of the 2 men that takes credit for sending the Vatican envoy from the United States to the Vatican, something this country hasn't done for many, many, many years. Robert Keith Gray is proud that he did that, and the second man who takes credit for having a Knight of Malta as ambassador to the Vatican is Senator Richard Lugar, the now head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who has close ties to the Vatican. Now, Mr. Lugar's name is controversial. I brought it up a while back on allegations that he was funded or picked up money from a Nazi in Switzerland at the time of Nixon's elections. I talked about that on broadcast number 600 in 1983, and also another broadcast on Senator Lugar. There were two that I did, two tapes on Lugar, one on 620 and one on 600, if you want to look them up. One story, it broke in the newspaper, the Senator Lugar bizarre scheme, Swiss bank and transfer of money. That was what it was titled. And it had to do with the signature of Horia Sima, a fugitive and Nazi war criminal living in Spain, who wrote a check that Lugar had picked up and put into a Swiss bank for funds for the Republican Party. There are many links of known Nazi war criminals, such as Licio Gelli and other Nazis, many of them funding the GOP and lined up with the GOP. Nikolai Moloxin, the office of Richard Nixon, the book Wanted Search for the Nazis by Mr. Bloom goes into Nazis live in America, but the most controversial is the one that goes into Richard Nixon's office and uses it as a dummy front in Whittier. Now, this last election, to show you how important these Vatican links are and how they can affect our Congress, there was an election in November, and Senator Charles Percy wanted the nomination. He's in Illinois. And he was pushed out of the seat by a gentleman named Michael Goland, Goland, from Los Angeles. And Goland moved to Illinois for 1 year and took up a residency and put in $1 million to defeat Percy. Now, this Goland has links to Israel, but the article on the fellow in Los Angeles Times, December the 5th, said, "A man who helped topple Senator Percy won't say why." Now, what happened when Senator Percy didn't win the election in November to go back to the Senate, he was in charge of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So by his being out of the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Richard Lugar took the position. So somebody who has possibly worked with a Nazi war criminal, with taking money into Swiss banks from Madrid, who has ties to Nazis and to the Vatican, is in charge of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The overt purpose of this toppling of Mr. Goland, as I say, is that he is pro-Israel. But the story of his money seems to be secret, and the point is that somebody close to the Vatican might have wanted Lugar to be head of the Foreign Relations Committee. He's close to the ambassador that he wanted in. He pushed that, along with Robert Keith Gray, and he also in November got his promotion into the Senate. And I think it's significant the way our senators are soon to be moved out and bought, so that the liking of them, whatever the Vatican or the CIA wants, unlimited money will pour $23 million into Jesse Helms in North Carolina. Money not identifiable from sources all over the world can come and push these men out until we get a Senate that is all of one mind, no controversy, and behind it all is the possibility of the Vatican movers of William Casey and the various agents, William Wilson, and people traveling back and forth as Knights of Malta. This book says William Casey of the CIA and William Wilson were two people that told the Pope about liberation theology, that it is, in quotes, the greatest danger the church faces in Latin America. Liberation theology is political activism of priests. It means to liberate you from the death squads of El Salvador, to liberate you from Somoza, to divide up the property, to feed the poor, educate them, and have a better land use. So the Central Intelligence Agency, through Casey and Wilson, say to the Pope, as if this Auschwitz Pope didn't know it, that is the greatest danger the church. In other words, you will suffer. Our CIA has told us that if you don't do something about liberation theology, your church, the Vatican, will suffer. So the chapter in this book goes on. The CIA, through their weekly briefings to the Pope, and both through that and the Knights of Malta, keep telling the Vatican of their strategy. And it's formulated earlier by the predecessor, Richard Helms, and they help the Vatican on how to combat clerical dissidents, as if the Vatican needs that help. But they're whispering or yelling into the Pope's ear. So that Casey, as a Knight of Malta, his excuse is, in quotes, he only has the good of the church in mind. Well, I don't know if the church in mind is what William Casey should have. There is the United States of America, and our interests may not be the same as the church. The church and the CIA are pushing inquisitions and crusades. And if you don't like the Spanish crusades in Madrid, or you don't know about them, get a few history books and look that up. $30 million last week was given by the intelligence community and the Defense Department to Mr. Pinochet in Chile, in spite of the repressions and the rounding up of 1,000 or 2,000 of the youth. And as I said last week, Mr. D'Aubuisson was honored last week for what he did in El Salvador, admitting that he did set up the death squads in El Salvador where there are 50,000 people dead. So why Mr. Casey thinks he has the church in mind, the good of the church in mind, somewhere along the line there should be brakes put on this, where we say, are the interests of the Catholic Church identical with the interests of the many people in the United States of America who don't approve of wiping out those middlemen, the priests, the nuns, the archbishops, who are trying to better the lives of the very poor people that they have to work with. Now, in the book The Year of Armageddon, they tell about the briefing of the church do-gooders, the people who try to help the priests, and they snidely remark about them as do-gooders, and one of the examples is Father Romero down in El Salvador. The CIA trains and finances police forces in Latin America that have tortured, murdered bishops and archbishop, priests, and nuns. And these men are asking, Mr. Thomas and Morgan, how is it the Vatican goes along with that when members of their own church are being killed? Well, they're told that those people who were killed are enemies of the state because they have liberation theology. So there's no contradiction in being killed if you don't think like the people at home think, which is good for the Vatican. This book goes on. John Paul's Vatican envoy to Washington, D.C., Pio Laghi, L-A-G-H-I, knows that the U.S. Institute for Religion and Democracy, the initials IRD, was established in 1981, 3 years ago, and has received funds from the American institutions previously acted as CIA monetary outlets. The Vatican knows that the CIA is already funding the Institute for Religion and Democracy and for Mr. Pio Laghi's work with that. And it goes on to say the IRD is currently engaged in a powerful campaign against church activists who do not agree with the Reagan administration or the policies in El Salvador or Latin America where they oppose the repressive regimes. So hand in hand, the Pio Laghi, and he is the Vatican envoy to our government. Now, the governments have exchanged ambassadors. He's the equivalent of the ambassador from the Vatican to Washington, D.C. Now, just a few weeks ago, November the 11th, 1984, in the London Times, there's a story about our ambassador from the Vatican, the current ambassador who gets these briefings and works with the Pope, Mr. Pio Laghi. And the title of the article is Nuncio at Death Camp. This comes out of the London Times. It says the Pope's envoy to Washington, Monsignor Pio Laghi, has been accused of having toured a camp in 1976 set up by the ruling junta to murder left-wingers. Laghi, as a papal envoy to Argentina, before he was the envoy to the United States, he was down there in Argentina, kept silent the secret of these murders for 5 years. He was guarded. The camp is the Nueva Baviera camp in the Tucumán province. Newspapers of the time, this is going back to 1976, said that Laghi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, say he lectures to the soldiers in the barracks who do the killings on the need to protect Argentina from the dangers of outside forces. He goes there, he was going there in 1976, and for 5 years talking to the men in case they had a conscience on the necessity to protect Argentina, that they're endangered from an invasion of ideas, of foreign ideas. So Laghi was helping the men who tortured, and 30,000 people were murdered, which is, according to this article, a euphemism for, they were missing, which is a euphemism for being murdered. Now, there 14 other bishops were named in the newspaper clippings going back to that time period. I guess they thought nobody would ever look this up, just as Allen Dulles thought nobody would read the Warren Commission exhibits and hearings. At least 14 other bishops and high-ranking clergy in Argentina were regular visitors at the death camp. One priest traveled to 3 camps to absolve the guilt of the torturers. The role of the priest there was to tell the torturers, it's all right, kids, because the worst thing that can happen to Argentina is to be endangered by an invasion of ideas. You can't have a new idea, so kill these people because they have maybe a new idea on how to grow crops, how to divide the land, how to build shelters, low-cost housing. All of these are dangerous ideas, health care, or even changing the president. The president now, as a democracy, he's been trying to investigate the murders that took place in Argentina, and that's why these articles are coming out. The London Times said none of the priests, none of the Vatican, ever denounced the military junta's dirty tricks where these 30,000 disappeared. This information that just came out this last November, according to the London Times, has made the Vatican furious and has enraged the Vatican, because the new president, Raul Alfonsine, has revealed the secret list of those who cooperated with the killings and the torture in the Vatican, and among them was the nuncio at the death camp, Pio Laggi, the current ambassador from the Vatican to Ronald Reagan. So you can imagine what he thinks on current Central American affairs after advising torturers, ensure with the permission of the Pope that it's kosher and okay. One survivor of the death camps provided information in the London Times about this. He's living in Spain. He's afraid he'll be killed. He's gotten death threats. And he personally saw Mr. Laggi there. And in fact, he was interviewed by him or saw him in the prison. And he asked him, did your family know where you were? Because these people were taken away. And this is one fellow who was lucky enough to live. And he promised him, this Vatican envoy, that he'd call the family and say he saw him, which he never did. And in conclusion on this section on the Vatican and the CIA, these authors say the Pope is aware of both the CIA and their links with one of his favorite secret societies, the Opus Dei. The Pope knows that the CIA is linked to the Opus Dei. We might have figured this out with the kind of prominent people in there, but this is a time where it is reprinted in a book so you can see it, and it goes on to say the Opus Dei in Chile receives indirect financial support from the Central Intelligence Agency. The agency provides Opus Dei with evidence of Jesuits who challenge the papal pronouncement. Can you imagine anything so sickening or insidious as this? Going very slowly on this, I have a lot of material, but I can't think of anything worse. The CIA tells the Opus Dei of evidence of particular Jesuits who challenge the papal pronouncements or who are involved in political causes the CIA opposes. So in addition to snitching at all other levels, the Opus Dei is a group that functions for the Vatican as well as the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. It goes on, it was the CIA who suggested to John Paul that he should encourage the Opus Dei to begin working in Poland. One time it was revealed that the Pope gave Lech Walesa $50 million, and later there's sort of a scandal because there wasn't a trace of what the money went to, just for demonstrations. And in conclusion, it says the Vatican and the CIA will always reach each other through the church institutions. There is, besides the CIA, there's the Knights of Malta and the Opus Dei. Now, is there a solution to this? Yes. Cut off every public official who is appointed or nominated who has an allegiance to the Church of Rome, and only allow, if you're going to have Catholic people working for you, let them be good Catholics or Catholics, and not the kind that promise they'll do the snitching and do the kind of work that the Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta are doing. Their obedience shouldn't always be to the Church of the Roman Empire. There are other things at stake here, and people have to learn to live along with each other. So, and the Vatican feels better dead than red. So they encourage the snitches, and then the pressure comes down, and these people lose jobs, lose homes, and are killed. A very dangerous situation, and Many of those names, every time they come up in the news in another format, I'll run them down again because they are prominent in decision-making policies right here in the United States. They affect the entire world. Now, another group of people that are just as dangerous as the Knights of Malta, and I have to slip this in before I get back to Mr. Wild Bill Donovan, are these private armies that are formed that are raising money on their own with the, in quotes, on their own, with the Defense Department, with the CIA. When Congress says we sent enough to those people, we have no record of what they do with it, or they're torturing, and there's too many death squads. When the elected members of 50 states are sent to Congress, and the congressmen vote on a certain issue, and goodness knows it's hard to get an agreement on that issue, if the certain persons affiliated with violence and killings and counter-espionage and guerrilla warfare don't like the decisions of the elected government, they go out on their own. And I have a large amount of articles piled up on just that fact. But the Washington Post had a very important story December the 10th, 1984, on this that epitomizes how insidious this is, and this is really the seeds. This is our Gestapo because it links to those same Christian fundamentalists that I talked about last week and the week before, the Nazis and clans. There are direct connections of these people to the men in Idaho and to their national and international roots. Now, the title of the Washington Post story is Private Groups Press Contra Aid. The title says they press it. After you read the story, they've already given millions. It says they've raised millions. They have given out millions down to South America. This is the way the article goes. A network of conservative activists, of military and intelligence officials, including several members of a Pentagon advisory panel on Central America, have stepped up efforts to funnel money, private money, that they call humanitarian aid to the Nicaragua rebels. John Singlaub is one of those people in charge of this. Retired General John Singlaub, president of the World Anti-Communist League, raises $500,000 a month from wealthy citizens and groups since Congress cut off the back for the CIA funds. And I'm sure you've read this before, how they're funding the Contras. John Singlaub works with the Nazis. He works out of Taiwan. He works with Reverend Moon and Mr. Sasakawa, with Pinochet in Chile, around the world. He's on the board of Western Goals that's still functioning and was part of that board when $100,000 was placed in Los Angeles to take documents on people who were law-abiding citizens in 1975 and in the 60s that were ordered destroyed, and feeding them into these computers with that mysterious John Reese from London. And John Reese's wife, Louise, was on the staff of Senator Joe McCarthy. Their track record shows they're not on any humanitarian activities, and all of a sudden their halo's so bright you can hardly read the article because they want to send humanitarian material to these countries to protect the death squads in El Salvador and the torture there, and to put the Somoza people back into power in Nicaragua. It says Singlaub has raised, as I say, $500,000 a month. Singlaub will do what the Defense Department wants, and the Defense Department does what Singlaub wants. And in this article, it melts the two. It says Singlaub and others have not only sent millions of dollars in uniforms, food, medicine, and other aid to Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, but the Defense Department has helped coordinate their aid. They're doing this, and as I say, it says because Congress cut off the money, the elected officials cut it off, the Defense Department works with them. Singlaub, who was recalled from South Korea by Jimmy Carter, formed a private institute to train police forces in El Salvador and possibly the Contras and soldiers if the United States government will not. That doesn't sound very humanitarian to me. He has an institute called the Institute for Regional and International Studies in Boulder, Colorado, which is run by Alexander McCall from Soldiers of Fortune. He's the military affairs editor of Soldiers of Fortune. And, of course, you get the Mr. Brown of Soldiers of Fortune with the Christian Defense League, the fringe area of the fight it out yourself. We'll go in and do it, cut them up and slice them up if your government will let us. We have Soldiers of Fortune, Singlaub, and the Pentagon working together briefing and helping each other. We'll take a 1-minute break and get back to this story in about 1 minute. This is Mae Brussell. It's broadcast number 681, December the 24th, 1984. This is side 2 of this tape. John Singlaub, on the board of Western Goals, a warrior from guerrilla tactics and warfare in Southeast Asia and around the globe, particularly in Southeast Asia, working with the Pentagon, having a meeting with the Pentagon. He set up his own institute in Colorado, and the institute is run by Mr. McCall of the Soldier of Fortune. And Soldier of Fortune, of course, has G. Gordon Liddy to their conventions, and Gordon Novell, and the late Mitchell Warbell, and the various far-right savages, I call them savages, of our spy systems, all coordinated and working together, and all part of the Permindex operation. I'll get back to the OSS and the Permindex, the OSS CIA Donovan connections, because all of these people are a product of it. And I have to take the current news and show you how they're acting in the present as well as in the past. Now, this article goes on the Washington Post. Singlaub met with the Defense Department in May of 1984 to study the wars in Central America and offer advice on U.S. military history. Now, if you think of the failures of what these military men and retired intelligence and generals have behind them, what they've done with a dictatorship in Bolivia, and what they've with Mr. Balazar before the current government changed hands, and that will be out by May or June of 1985. The relationship with the cocaine king in Bolivia and the Nazis there, and the relationship of Singlaub to Southeast Asia and Nuganhan, and the dope pouring into this country, and the fascism in Taiwan, and the policies of this country. They have been a failure in so many countries, and all of a sudden they become experts on military history at the Pentagon. Nation magazine ran a story by Peter Stone on this meeting in May, and he said it was held at the request of Fred Ickley, the Undersecretary of the Defense for Policy. Singlaub, plus many veterans of the guerrilla warfare of the Philippines, Korea, and South Vietnam, included retired General Edward G. Lansdale and General H.C. Anderholt. I know Charles Veer's hair will stand on end when you understand it, how much he has studied Lansdale, and anyone who wants to know the policies of Southeast Asia, you study Lansdale. So here we have Lansdale, the Soldiers of Fortune, which are the private armies, then the Singlaubs, who are, again, the secret private armies, then with the Defense Department that are over armies but are doing actions that are not allowed by Congress. So really, they are a government into and by themselves. There's no other way you can slice it. In the book Deadly Deceits, Ralph McGee discusses just a little bit about Lansdale. I could cite many, many stories about him, but because he is advising on guerrilla warfare in the Central America. Remember, Henry Kissinger, their buddy, and the armchair buddy of all these fellows, went over to Central America first and put suggestions into order that they're working on now. In the book Deadly Deceits, it describes how the OSS, during the war, the Office of OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, and this again goes back to Donovan, before there was a CIA, and Donovan was the head of the OSS, had agents staged and over with Vietnam, and they worked in cooperation, the Vietnamese with the OSS, and the OSS gave them weapons and ammunition to train the guerrilla into an organized army. And once the Japanese surrendered in August of 1945, these people thought they would be free and have a democracy for the first time. And by 1945, Vietnam was, for the first time in the history, free of foreign domination. Then when the French begin to pull out, the Americans come in and take over, and the U.S. policymakers decided the French lost their will to fight in Vietnam. The Vietnamese helped fight the Japanese and wanted their own country. So the French say, well, we'll get out now. They want it, and they fought against the Japanese. So the French get out, and lo and behold, in comes Mr. Diem, handpicked by the National Security Council, August the 20th, 1954. And it cites the example, Diem was supposed to broaden the governmental base, elect an assembly, and take over. The French are out now, and the DM is going to be there in Vietnam, just building up to our friend Mr. Lansdale. Once the decision was made, overnight the CIA intelligence had to decide on the situation in Vietnam. The French would be out. The decision is made. We'll take over. Let's put in DM. DM now was portrayed as the miracle worker who was saving Vietnam. To make the illusion a reality, the CIA undertook a series of operations that helped him turn South Vietnam into a vast police state, from the democracy to the miracle worker. The purpose of these operations was to force the native South Vietnamese to accept the Catholic Mandarin DM. And here's Donovan, the importance of the Vatican, being knighted by the Vatican, the military order of the Vatican, the soldier, the sovereign military order. That soldier says, we'll put in a Catholic, Mr. DM, and make a police state. If you don't want to be a Catholic, you'll have a police state. So DM, through Donovan, and then Mr. Casey, his protege also, and many of the CIA that were Knights of Malta, but particularly Donovan's hands over there in Southeast Asia, they made DM a head of the Catholic Mandarin, and he was selected by U.S. policymakers to provide an alternative to communism in Vietnam. If you don't want the Russians, if you don't want communism and divide up the property, take our Catholic puppet, Mr. DM. McGee says it was a strange choice. From 1950 to 1953, while Ho's forces were earning the loyalty of the people fighting the French, Mr. DM, a short, fussy bachelor, was in the United States at the Mary Knoll Cemetery in New Jersey and New York. Mr. Donovan, Raymond Donovan, Secretary of Labor, studied at these Catholic places and wanted to be a priest. Mr. DM was at the seminaries in New Jersey and New York as a good Catholic. DM arrived in Saigon in mid-1954 and was greeted by Colonel Edward Lansdale, the CIA man in South Vietnam and the head of the agency's Saigon military mission. DM was opposed by virtually every element of South Vietnamese society. And this is so important because we're going to let Mr. Lansdale and Mr. Singlaub and these various people from Soldier of Fortune decide for these poor people down in Central America who will run them and who will run their countries. And if they don't take who we want, we'll split their bellies open and pour the salt in and gouge out their eyes. Mr. Lansdale decided every element of South Vietnamese society, Bao Dai's followers, the pro-French religious sects, the Buddhists. Bao-Dai was the one who had captured their interest or mind. His followers were the pro-French, the religious sect, the Buddhists, the remnant nationalist organizations, and of course followers of Ho Chi Minh. He had no troops, no police, no government, no means of enforcing his rule. But what he did have was the complete support of Colonel Lansdale, who came in and all the money and all the manpower and the weapons and training and propaganda and the political savvy in the CIA's covert action chest, and to create DM's government, to take over then from those followers, to create that. Lansdale was behind operating teams in North Vietnam. He stimulated North Vietnamese Catholics and the Catholic armies to desert and come south, and the teams would be promised Catholic Vietnamese assistance out of the Vatican and new opportunities if they would emigrate. And to help contribute to this, they would tell the people up north, they had brochures that they handed and leaflets they passed out telling them that the Viet Minh, what to expect of the citizens in the new government. That they attributed to the northern Vietnamese what was going to happen to them if they stayed there. So they appealed to the Catholics to come down, get support, fight the army, do any lies you want, and the covert action began. Now that is Mr. Lansdale, just one little page on a long career, sitting there in the Pentagon with General H.C. Anderholt, Anderholt. 8 people met in the Defense Department in May of 1984, and they had a decision to move from the conventional warfare in El Salvador. The conventional warfare has only killed 50,000 so far and kept the property in the hands of those 14 families. But they're going to improve and increase the emphasis on psychological warfare, civil action, and break into small units. Anderholt heads a 1,500-member Air Commando Association at Fort Walton Beach in Florida. And so they came in to advise them. What you need is what Soldier of Fortune shows in their magazines month after month, what Mr. Brown pushes, what Mr. McCall pushes, what Mr. Singlau pushes, all tied together and working in the Defense Department and having their own institute for regional and international studies in Boulder, Colorado. And they're going to get the Defense Department to do what Congress doesn't want to do and emphasize which kind of weapons is transferred for other ones. And the article goes on with the kind of weapon substitute, which is technical, but which is ridiculous. And one of the points of this article is that they're going to send in medical supplies for these people, that this is all humanitarian. Now, all you have to do is take the people that we're meeting and take what they've published and take where they've lived and use the examples of the countries they've been to. And you know there's more than medicine and food and clothing going on in this operation. Now, they went on to say they've raised millions of dollars, Mr. Anderholt, and the Defense Department, in quotes, hasn't helped much because of congressional opposition, but they have offered to help them in some ways. Their big problem, they say, in quotes, is the liberals in Congress. You see, the bleeding hearts and the liberals would ruin everything for them. Now, Singlau has another organization. He has many of them. I have his name on many, many groups where he gets help from the Pentagon. He has the Institute for Regional and International Studies in Boulder, Colorado, on how to use these other types of warfare. That's one group that's formed now. And the other is the U.S. Council for World Freedom. And this, admittedly, in the Washington Post, received substantial coordinating help from the Pentagon. So tell me the difference. Why not just say the United States is at war against the Nicaraguan government, declare war, which we really have done, but we hide it through these various organizations. It's so insidious, the way they hide the operations, and yet in a way they're not hidden. They're in the newspaper, but Congress seems to not be able to put the brakes on, because when they vote no, you've had enough, or no, Mr. Duarte still has all these massacres or deaths, no, we don't like what's going on, we want some accountability. Well, then they have meetings at the Defense Department between McCall and Singlau and Lansdale, and all the sleazy rot from the last years that's been going on, last 20 years and before. But obviously what they did in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam is a horrible mess, just as these Middle East advisors, Henry Kissinger, helping Middle East and Asia, now Central America, Middle East is a mess of what's going on with Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Lebanon. All of our policies, these have been failures. These advisors are mentally sick. They are actually psychologically sick. And what's more sick is that they always get together to think who they can ruin next. And they don't look back and realize who they're hurting or how they're hurting. And they're just drunk on their own power. And because these people go beyond the reach of what Congress votes or wants, you can't say enough about them. And I have many, many articles on this gang, but they are a threat because, again, when America has food riots, when there's unemployment, if the banks collapse, if there are people gunned down like Mr. Berg, the radio announcer in Colorado, by one of their cohorts and buddies, if the Klan and the Nazis had taken Dominica, and the fact that they failed doesn't mean they won't take other islands. When these people work together and have everything else they want, there's only one thing left, and that's America, the United States of America. That's us. Keep looking at us, because these people have our tax money. They have the approval. There's no brakes on this car. This motor is going fast down the hole. And the same sleazy characters who should have been removed after Vietnam for the Agent Orange, for the Phoenix program, for the tiger cages, for the torture, they should have been retired and sent to some kind of a funny farm and bring in new people, because the old way didn't work. It bankrupted us. Our people from Vietnam are divided. They're sick. They're drugged. They fill the prisons. They have nightmares and diseases from the chemicals that were there. Why is it that they are allowed to come home and put on their uniforms again and go into the institutions that we have here and start all over with another piece of territory, another country, and break it up until, as I say, nothing is left in America? Then they'll be sitting in the Pentagon, as they have already with the Garden Plot and their FEMA, the Federal Emergency, to decide then what to do for us. They already have their chain of command ready, and then we become the final and the last victims. And someday maybe the Soviet Union will have to free and save us before they can be free to fight those people that will take control and have control of our government. We may be rescued by Russia someday, so don't be too hard on them. Now, getting back to Donovan and the roots of this disease, we're talking about the overt cancers on this body politic. That's what John Dean told Nixon. Those messages didn't last too long. People don't remember that part of it. But where did the roots of this come? This Donovan of the OSS with the Vatican written in the book on the Armageddon. How about Donovan, the OSS with Southeast Asia? Going back to a few pages on Donovan and the control of news media and propaganda and the power, and to remind you of his work with Rockefeller Institute, with Herbert Hoover, and then with J. Pierpont Morgan, and then forming this OSS. Continue with the line of thought. Then he went to England to William Stevenson and Intrepid and merged the intelligence mind control programs, the psychological warfare, and the British intelligence with the United States intelligence, plus the Vatican sovereign military Knights of Malta to represent the Vatican interests at the same time. This pages are from 124 to 126 that I'm referring to in the book by Corey Ford on Donovan the OSS. It says, in Washington, D.C., in the building, the National Health Institute, the institute was evacuated and moved upstairs, and in that building, the COI was born, the Office of Coordinator of Information. The COI was born. Down below the National Health Institute, which is a marvelous place for Donovan to be, because when World War II was over and in the OSS, he was put on the board of the American Cancer Society. And I cited just last week, 2 weeks ago, how our government tested giving live cancer cells to people to spread the disease, not to cure. In those buildings, the National Health Institute, they were moved upstairs. Donovan's Office of Coordinator of Information took place, the headquarters for Mr. Donovan. It started during the wartime with radio broadcasts against the Nazis, and the certain people from the government decided that they would study the broadcasts and counteract them for what would eventually be like Radio Free Europe or Radio America, the propaganda media, or to counteract German and Japanese propaganda at the time. It started with radio broadcasts against the Nazis, and then it grew to combine independent news networks with the War Department. And I'm just reading again the book on CBS, the origins of CBS, and the roots of these new networks, how they were independent stations and then to grow to be these networks. After December the 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, the independent American broadcasting industry, the ABC, NBC, CBS, the independent American broadcasting industry that was not linked to the government or the military agencies, became, in quotes, more cooperative with Donovan, who was working as an American agent. Robert Sherwood, the playwright, worked for Donovan in the OSS, and he had a falling out over Donovan because he felt that the director of the COI, the coordinator of information, shouldn't be against Franklin Roosevelt. He hated Franklin Roosevelt. He hated the New Deal, and he felt that it wasn't right to have somebody is in charge of this like Donovan. Roosevelt appointed him, but it was probably the pressure from the Morgans and that put him there, in that position, strategic position of the OSS. But Sherwood objected to the appointment of Donovan. At the same time, he had been appointed the director for Foreign Information Service when they were just forming after Pearl Harbor. And they used the powerful NBC antenna from New Jersey to Paris. And that's how the networks became part of the War Department and have stayed that way ever since. And the CBS transmitter was on Long Island. And this book says Colonel Donovan believed that once a state of war existed, the propaganda arm should be exploited as a weapon of deception and subversion, and should be under the military supervision. And there's a letter in this book to Franklin Roosevelt that Donovan sent. Now that we are at war, Foreign propaganda must be employed as an instrument of war, a judicious mixture of rumor and discretion and mixing truth as bait to foster disunity and confusion in support of military operations, that you use rumors, you use deceptions, and not much discretion, mostly deceptions, and truth, a little bit of truth to bait them, give them a little bit of truth, then whammo, break them up. And the main purpose is confusion in military operations. And he felt that propaganda is an arrow. This is Donovan. Propaganda is an arrow of initial penetration in preparing the people of a territory where the invasion may be contemplated. It is the first step. Then comes the fifth column. Those are the people inside the government that are going to make it collapse from underneath and working with the press. The press comes in there and works with them. Then the militarized raiders or the commandos, and those are your special forces, your soldiers of fortune, your Green Berets, and so your Rangers. Finally, the invading divisions when you bring in the whole bang and group. Nothing has changed much, even with the Grenada invasion. They did this kind of thing, the confusions, and the students needed rescuing, and the papers saying they're in trouble. They're American students that may be hostages, and then in come the commandos, and finally the troops come in, and that's the way it goes. Now, Robert Sherwood objected the tactics of Donovan that he wrote in, this was in March of 1942, and this is what he told Franklin Roosevelt, and this is very important to the matters we study now. It seems a long time ago, 1942, but it's pertinent today, and Robert Sherwood wrote this. He said, propaganda broadcasts should stick scrupulously to the facts and let the truth prevail. The American image overseas would suffer if we emulated the Axis and it resorted to lies and deceits. The American image would suffer. The agency of news, of propaganda and communications should be under civilian direction and not be a supporting arm of the military establishment which Mr. Donovan wanted, because in time it would become an American Gestapo. This is Robert Sherwood, the well-known playwright, wrote The Petrified Forest, one of my favorite stories, or plays. Okay, he is saying that propaganda should stick. If you want to tell them, propaganda doesn't have to be a lie. It's something you can say over and over again, like, if we win the war, we will give you all of you housing, or we'll give you clothing, or we will have full employment. You don't have to tell lies about your enemy. Tell the truth of what would happen if you win the war. What would be better? He says, when you emulate your enemy and their methods, and you resort to lies and deceits, it is a problem you will always suffer and never get over. The agency of news, propaganda, communication should be under civilian control. I'm repeating this again, civilian control, because it should not be the military branch of the establishment which Mr. Donovan wanted and which Mr. Donovan got, because in time it would become an American Gestapo. Now, when Mr. Truman didn't resign, he was out of office, his time was up. When he stepped out, he referred to the American Gestapo that he had created when the CIA was formed in 1947, literally the Gestapo. When Eisenhower left, he talked about the military-industrial establishment. The military establishment is what was referred to and the Gestapo by this well-known playwright objecting to the Mr. Donovan's tactics. And remember, at this time in 1942, Mr. Donovan had Mr. Morley on from the Vatican and had another purpose that he was serving, the Vatican Church, and he would be knighted for it, and he would do things that Rome wanted that were not what the American government wanted, but were okay for the Crusades and the Inquisition. It was okay for them, but America had our share of problems with slaves and the blacks and the Indians, and to bring in possible inquisitions later or Gestapo is something the United States does not need and didn't need. Now, this book goes on. Colonel William Donovan, during World War II, kept working with the government agencies, and at the time, in the news media business, there was a proliferation of government information agencies. He was working with them. There was the COI's Foreign Information Service, the one with Robert Sherwood, the OFS, the Office of Facts and Figures, under Archibald MacLeish, the OGR, the Office of Government Reports, the OCD, the Office of Civilian Defense, the OEM, the Office of Emergency Management. Now, these communication agencies in 1942 to 45 were getting $30 million a year of government funds. I heard somebody saying on a talk show this week you shouldn't object to the nuclear arrangements that Ronald Reagan has because he was elected by a majority. And that is so wrong. He was elected by a majority, but the problem is that the majority were only given the information that the ABC, the NBC, and CBS or Turner Broadcasting gives you, and it is all controlled, very heavily controlled. And these people already were mingling with the government way back then, and it's hard to get decisions or facts to the American people with this kind of money, $30 million of government funds, into the controlling of literally the minds of the people or what they're to know at that time. Now, it goes on that facts were elaborated and distorted. Some things were taken from Mr. Sherwood's office, the Foreign News. Editor Barnes selected things of interest. He handed them to writers and researchers. They were put on a private teletype, and they weren't exactly what he said. Facts were ingeniously elaborated or distorted, just like they are today. You can say the Russians have X amount, 10 times more than we have. You can say that down in Grenada that Mr. Bishop, Maurice Bishop, has an airstrip solely for the purpose of Russia invading Central America. Facts were distorted, elaborated, and taken from the Foreign Office and given to other people. In other words, what Mr. Sherwood sent in wasn't what they got out. In June of 1942, Mr. Donovan left his Washington offices, and all these men with their $30 million in media linked up to the major networks and went to work with Colonel Menzies and Mr. Hambro and Lord Mountbatten over in London. And this is very important. And by Order 9182, they created the OSS. In this OSS, it was formed as soon as he gets to London, and it was a more informal organization at the time of Pearl Harbor, with the British intelligence, the secret British intelligence, the special operations executives from London, Mr. Hambro, Menzies, and Mountbatten. Names very important to the future. They created the OSS under the direction and supervision of the Joint Chief of Staff of the United States Army, and they would take over the coordination of information, so that the Joint Chief of Staff and the coordination of information, that office, then began to be in the hands of the Army with all those millions of dollars of propaganda. The civilian aspect was swallowed up by Pentagon Order 9182 that created the OSS. All the clear white propaganda was handled by the Office of War Information, and all the lies, all the covert information, all the black propaganda was under William Donovan's OSS. The green light, the presidential order for the lies, was given to Mr. Donovan, who 2 years later would be knighted by the Pope among 100 special people, and then come home and form the CIA. So this is the transfer, a very important item of the transfer of the news media that first begins as one branch and then mingles with the networks, our major networks, and then goes under the umbrella of the Defense Department when OSS was formed, 9182 order. It was to collect, analyze strategic information, and here in quotes was one of the things that Donovan wanted, in quotes, to enforce our will upon the enemy by means other than military action in support of actual or planned military operations, including unorthodox warfare, guerrilla activities, resistance groups, subversion, and sabotage. The director of the OSS would be William Donovan. And here is the seed, the roots of what was planted for Southeast Asia then in 1945 and 1954 with Mr. Lansdale and Mr. Singlaub and all these people working. Mr. Donovan is dead, but Mr. Casey, his protege, is our CIA director. And they sit there now and plan unorthodox warfare, guerrilla activities, resistance groups, subversion to enforce our will upon the enemy. And we, or they, decide who is the enemy. We have declared war against Nicaragua because they didn't like Somoza, our West Point graduate. We declare war against the native populations of these various countries, against the poor masses of El Salvador. If the majority won the election here in this country, let the majority vote in El Salvador after you throw the guns away. So the point about Donovan is he combined these agencies. He took a trip to Great Britain. He used their British intelligence, melded with ours, as when Pearl Harbor was over. And this was the beginning. This was the roots. And then the man has the influence of his Knights of Malta to go in and out of the Vatican, to snitch on the priests, to snitch on the nuns, to force the lower echelon of the poorer Catholics to shape up to whatever fascist government you want them to obey in, to not think for themselves. It's no different than Jonestown, Jim Jones. People ask about cults. These religions are cults. You take orders, you call the head man father, yes, father. He becomes your father, replaces your natural father, and then you are allowed to do what is black propaganda, covert operations, guerrilla warfare, breaking down resistance groups, subversion and sabotage, which includes bombing places and blowing up, like the Bologna bombing, the train stations and the tunnels where people are killed and mutilated. Well, our time is up now. This is the end of this broadcast. We can't stretch this tape anymore. But Donovan and the roots of our agencies are important, and how they operate are important, and how they are working today in the Pentagon in Central America is terribly important. The bloodshed just keeps rolling on and on. It had a beginning, and hopefully it'll have some end. This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week. You take care, and have a good year that is coming along pretty soon.